friends from AID and from the Alliance. I met you all in 2002 when Shankar, my colleague, and I came here immediately after the genocide in Gujarat to speak on right to information and on the after effect of the genocide. I met lots of you then, and I've grown older, definitely, and faces have changed. I think some of you are the same, but many of you are young and you come to study, and of course every so many years as a fresh lot of people, the staff of course remain the same. So I'm very glad to be with all of you, and I come here really to share both my concerns and my perplexities. Anyone who comes and says they have all the answers to any social phenomena, I think should be doubted. And especially in a country like India, which is so huge, which contradicts itself, and every turn you have a different, have one argument and you go from one part of India to the other, it is turned upside down. Nevertheless, I think the last couple of years in India have seen a very strong concern about what democracy is and how democracy should be used, and to what purpose and where it should go. We were just talking today and yesterday and the day before about how and from where you define what you see. I must profess that though I was born in a middle class family, I have lived the last 40 years in rural India. And therefore for me, the context of my thought, my work and my being is rooted in a small hut in Devguri, which has now become kind of symbolic because we are not traveling too much. But where in fact I meet common ordinary people who with their extraordinary common sense and their wisdom have made me not stray either in principle, precept or action from things that are important, and I owe them all a great deal. I am also not the only person from the MKSS who has the gift of being able to talk, to converse or communicate. It's unfortunate that because of language, many of my colleagues can never come to Harvard and never talk to you all. They are very bright people, they're brilliant people, and they're wonderful people. And if this Right to Information campaign was defined, it was defined by my young friend Sushila. I remember in 1996, after a series of public hearings, when we sat on a long dharna in Biawar for 40 days, we were on the streets, eating there, and we really got euphoric that time because we were supported by the entire community of beings. Everything came free. We of course spent very little. We slept on the road, all of us in the heat. But nevertheless, during that period, the NCPRI, the National Campaign for People's Right to Information, was born. Prabhat Joshi, Medha Patkar, and Nikhil Chakravarti, Kuldeep Nayyar, Ajit Bhattacharya from the journalist world, and so many others came, and the Right to Information law. The idea of a law and the idea of the campaign, the idea of struggle and the advocacy and the dialectic between these various things became clearer to us. But in 1996, when we went to Delhi to speak in front of a group of journalists, where amongst other people, V.P. Singh and I.K. Gujral were also present pushing the right to information. And they asked Sushila, why have you come? And how many of you understand Hindi? Ah, lovely. So then I can say many things in Hindi and I can translate for the few who don't understand. तो सुशीला से उन्होंने पूछा कि भाई तुम यहाँ क्यों आई? तुम्हारा क्या लेना देना है सूचना के अधिकार से? तुम तो गरीब हो, तुम्हें तो रोटी कपड़ा और मकान मांगना चाहिए, सूचना के अधिकार क्या मांग रहे हो तुम? सुशीला looked at them and then said with absolute confidence, मैं अपने बेटे को 10 रुपया देकर दुकान बेचती हूँ, तो उससे मैं हिसाब मांगती हूँ। ये सरकार मेरे अरबों खरबों रुपए खर्च करता है, हिसाब नहीं मांगूंगी क्या? हमारा पैसा, हमारा हिसाब. That became the slogan of the Right to Information campaign, contained the notion of transparency, of accountability, of public accounting, of the absolute legitimacy of a sovereign asking questions of their servants as to how they spend their money. So it is to people like Sushila, and there will be many anecdotes I hope this evening, I hope they do come naturally to me, and I'll be able to tell you. The MKSS is not an NGO, it's a non-party political formation. I know this sounds strange, but in India we have the heritage of Mahatma Gandhi, Jayaprakash Narayan, and many others who followed this issue of participating in politics without joining a political party or fighting for office. And I think this has given spawn a completely new kind of politics, of which so many people who met you, Medha, many of you must have met Medha, you met many others. We are all part of that ilk, where we are really political animals, but we are not part of any political party, and we do not want to constrict ourselves by the desire for votes and put ourselves into the limits of a political party. Nevertheless, there was an understanding that there would be a dialectic between conscience politics that was us and electoral politics that holds up the structure of democracy to work. So MKSS locates itself in this. We do not take any institutional funds. That means we don't even get money from well-meaning and good people like aid, but we go with our begging bowl. Wherever we go, we have always got a small donation box. We sell our materials, and we always ask people to give a little bit, not too much, so that we are kept tethered. Because the moment we do something that is not correct in terms of larger public actions or in terms of the immediate needs of people, people won't give it. So it keeps us morally and ethically on the ball. And we have always had enough. We have very low budgets, and we have had enough. And the context of our work is that India has 90, now they say 98, but in a conservative estimate, 93% of India's labor force is unorganized. And we are really working with the unorganized workers. People who do not have a steady steady job, let alone a job, even steady work. If you go and see the labor markets in most of India's small Kasbah towns and largest cities, you will find hundreds of people waiting there, asking for work. And so it's like sorting out vegetables. You know, somebody who wants labor goes there and sorts out persons and takes them there. So the plight of India's labor is pretty bad, and it has improved, but not substantially. So that's the context of the birth of the MKSS, and that's why Mazdoor Kisan Shakti Sanghathan. The organization grew out of a land struggle. People got together and formed the organization, and that is the details of the MKSS. I thought I should make that clear, because sometimes there are other confusions that arise. So that's just for that. So what do the poor say? What do Sushila and Chunni Singh, Lal Singh, Narayan, all of them say? Or many others. Gyarsi, many others. What do they say? They say they want democracy. When I go to Delhi, they say, oh, democracy has failed us, we should get rid of it, it's useless. What kind of democracy is this? India is no democracy. But if I talk to Norti Bai, who's the Sarpanch of Harmada, a small village, Panchayat, who's my guru, who taught me my trade union politics, a Dalit woman, a woman of extraordinary integrity, who's traveled to Beijing and to New York, but still remains the same. She's learned computers, she even holds computer classes, she is not literate. So Norti, who's a phenomenon, and for me has been, in a sense, the ideal of a woman who never stops learning, always struggles, and whose principles are tethered. Norti says, we need the Panchayat, we need the assembly, and we need the Lok Sabha, but it shouldn't work the way it is working. So let's not confuse the issue. We need it, but we need it to work better. They also need all the democratic institutions. So for them, democracy has delivered in part. They have got free from feudalism. They have got free from all kinds of oligarchical structures that existed in village society. For them, democracy has mattered. So today, the dilemma in front of them is that as they realize the power of their vote, as they get 50% reservation for women candidates, as they learn all this and they learn to operate all this, they also understand that the economic power is going to be severely limited. On the one hand, the Gram Sabha is told, your decision is final. Whatever you decide is the law. They decide they don't want the Coca-Cola factory, and the government of their state decides that there is a Coca-Cola factory, the Coca-Cola factory comes. They decide they don't want an SEZ, they don't want to give up their land, that's what the Gram Sabha decides, and the state government decides that that land will be acquired. So there is a huge dilemma amongst people who have learned the power of democracy just as people are about set to destroy democracy. And I say that because in the South Asian subcontinent, a new argument has come up as to whether parliamentary democracy is necessary for South Asia, and particularly for India and Nepal. These are serious arguments. Our friend in Nepal is saying that there should be a presidential form of government and not parliamentary systems. He's also divided Nepal into constituencies in such a manner that no Dalit can ever form constituency. So you have constituencies only delineated by their geographic area, and many people are scared that the new system that comes will not really remain democratic but become somewhat oligarchical, or it will be a very powerful elite that will rule Nepal. In India, we are very worried because parliamentary democracy still gives you the ability to control and face your politician. But in a presidential system, technocrats will rule India because the president will have his little board of technocrats. Not that India is not like that today. You have many people in India who are ruling. One take my dear friend who's never been to a village in many years now, and who decides from sitting in the planning commission that 23 rupees a day in a village and 32 rupees a day in an urban town will be sufficient for a poor family or to eat, or an individual to eat, for an individual to eat. The Right to Food campaign 6 months ago had a big demonstration outside the planning commission in which we took little boxes of what we could get for that amount of money that they said was good enough for a person to live on. And my box, which was marked Montek Singh Ahluwalia, which they made me carry, inside had 2 bus tickets. Coming to planning commission and going back from planning commission. That was all there was in it. So this is the extraordinary levels of technocracy, of crunching of numbers, that I cannot stand the phrase. I've never had a liking for jargon, but I cannot stand this phrase which our bureaucrats use all the time. So numbers and statistics cannot define reality for me. You can lie with statistics. It's a very good book called How to Lie with Statistics, which I read when I was very young. Maybe now it's passé, but it was a Penguin publication and written by an Englishman. So we want real democracy in India, which means that we want to control not only our political life, we want to control our economic existence. So we want to control livelihood, we want to control food security, we want to control employment, we want to say what we want, and we want to say which forests we want to keep, which river we want to dam, and which we do not want to dam. And that's why every democratic protest from Kandankulam recently, where they're saying that they don't want a nuclear plant in southern India, to POSCO and the other very well-known strikes and trouble spots where people are saying they do not want what is happening, you see the conflict between economic interest and political awareness. So if you say that India is not getting politically aware, I challenge that, because I think without the use of democratic power, these people would have been crushed. Even today, POSCO is holding out, because you cannot go and crush POSCO. And in fact, I heard, I don't know how much to rely on this, but I heard the Chief Minister of Odisha has said no violence in POSCO. I heard a story that the Korean team wanted to go and hold a workshop in the middle of the place where people are sitting on hunger strike. And the government of Odisha said you cannot. And actually, POSCO went ahead with the meeting, and the government of Odisha had to really almost arrest them and send them back to say, look, you can't interfere with this. But the Koreans who came said, but we want to hold the workshop. For me, the message that I get from this is that for many years we fought to get control over a defined landmass which was called India. Today, a company comes and overrules an elected government, whatever it may be, however it may be, overrules an elected government to say, I don't care what you think, but I'm going to do what I want in this territory because I have economic control over a small piece of land in which I will set up an industry. For me, there are serious issues, as there must be for you. Transparency and accountability, therefore, are crucial for India today. And that is why you find that RTI activists, 15 of them have died. Many of them, ordinary middle class people, just filed an RTI to know about land, know about mining issues, know about NREGA, to know about things in which a mafia has developed in our country today. So what happens is that because they ask these questions, which have far-reaching impact, they are annihilated. And the government is dragging its feet and has not done very much. But nevertheless, transparency is extremely important for my constituency, which is the poor. For them, it's their daily life. We have a slogan, "Hum janenge, hum jiyenge." If you know, the right to know is the right to live. Because if you don't have the right to know, you don't know what you can fight for, you don't have the right to live. It directly affects our lives, whether it's hospital medicines, whether it's PDS, whether it is the police station, you take it and we face slow death or immediate annihilation, it is the same. So we are faced with janenge, jiyenge kind of option. So for transparency for poor people has really been, the right to information has been a lifeline. So it has been used in multiple ways. But if we look at the larger issues that have been thrown up today in terms of transparency and the recognition of a government, I really think that having given the law, the government is, from within 7 months, they decided to amend it. They had a proposal to amend the law and they gave the law in May 2005 and I think in July, a year later, July 2006, we had to go on a big dharna again to demand that no amendments be made. They are using all kinds of powers to constrict the use of the law. All new laws that are being made begin with an overruling section which says, notwithstanding anything in any other act, this act will, which means that RTI is also overruled. So under that act, whatever that act gives you or says it will do, you cannot use the RTI against that act. And a lot of us fear that the UID is also a system. I don't know if you all know about the unique identification device, which is Nandan Nilekhani's baby, and with which many of us are deeply unhappy, including the Standing Committee of Parliament, which says that this whole process has lots of holes in it. But if we are going to seek information and store it in the state coffers and not tell us where they are storing it, how they will use it, and who will control it, and track me whether I am a Hindu or a Muslim or a Buddhist or a Jain or a Sikh, or whether I am a Maoist or if I have a right-leaning or a left-leaning or a broad left, or whether I am this or that, what I say about multinational investments, I can be easily tracked and targeted. They say it's not compulsory. Of course it's not compulsory. But you go to the bank, they will say unless you have a UID number, I won't open a bank account. So you'll open it. You'll have to have a UID. Like when they come into these countries now, and maybe even in India, I don't know whether they do it, you've got to give your thumbprints and they photograph your iris and I don't know what else they do. But it's all in the name of some terror or some fear. But what it is used for generally is to really amputate our freedom and our democracy. So there's a great fear in many of us that these tools that are being cultivated and given birth to might in fact affect India's transparent situation. But I want to go into, unfortunately this thing is not working at all. So maybe I should go into my PowerPoint and just show you some little things. Now, but this shouldn't make us feel hopeless. Because otherwise how will I survive? Because without hope you can't work. And like Norati, who says that there has to be hope, I also have to have some hope. But I hope my hope is based in genuine understanding of India's condition. And that's why I feel choosing between India and Bharat Maybe many of you know it, but Upendra Bakshi, when he talked 30 years ago, talked about India and Bharat. And Upendra Bakshi is one of the most well-known Indian jurists. He's got a wonderful mind and he's a great man. We all admire him a lot. He also became Vice Chancellor of Delhi University at some point. He said there are two Indias. There's India and there's Bharat. India is the India of people who have access to all resources, access to the law, and their citizens. And Bharat is for subjects. Bharat is those people who have no access to the law, no rights, and nothing at all. And so I live in a place which is Bharat. Bharat, there is nothing. Law means you don't have access to law, you don't have access to lawyers, you don't have access to the courts, you don't have access to the police. So there is no legal system, there is no rule of law. If you talk about food, you talk about anything, you talk about schools, worst kind of schools, with teachers who are terrible. And yet, we don't want private schools, we want those government schools to function, and every time we say something, they are told, oh, the government doesn't function, we will privatize. The private schools will not accommodate our poor children. One extraordinary comment was made by Sri Sri Ravi Shankar recently in Jaipur. Have you all heard it? What a statement he made. Just outside Jaipur, in a public function in a school, he said, government schools only produce Nakshalites. Children should go to private schools. Heavens, then the whole of India is full of Nakshalites. Because our poor children can't afford to go anywhere else. Quite the contrary. Our government schools give you nothing. So the children who go through that cannot be molded into anything. They are molded by society. Inshallah, they may get a few words, but there's nothing more that they get. So it's extraordinary that he made a statement like that. But we need public schools. In this entire argument, the worst thing for poor people is that we are saying that the private will substitute the state because it's more efficient. The main argument is public-private partnerships. A friend of mine sitting there might like to add something at the end of what I say as to what is done in health. But anyway, these public-private partnerships are really a threat to the freedom, access and rights of poor people. Because when it becomes private, it becomes totally opaque, there is no transparency, there is no access, and there is no money to pay for it. And this is a huge battle we are fighting. We are saying you want to have it, have a people-government partnership. Let us then stand there and monitor what you are doing. Why do you want to have private money? And then give it away completely. I don't think people who suffer from TB have already started having problems. They can't afford the drugs now. Already it's begun because the price has quadrupled. Sometimes it's gone up 10 times. So if you want to go to a private dispensary and buy your TB medicines, you will definitely die of TB because you can't afford to buy those medicines. The choice is between those medicines and a good diet. And without a good diet, TB can never be cured.
Is this the one?
Sorry.
You want this one?
Next.
You just did it.
So sorry.
No.
Anyway, it's not even visible. This is just to locate myself, this is the house in Devduli where the Right to Information movement and struggle was born. It still remains more or less the same. And in this house, in the debates, in the courtyard of this house, the concepts and ideas of the RTI were born, the principles were born. The law itself was not fashioned here. The law, as I told you all, was fashioned in Delhi by Justice Sawant, who was chairperson of the Press Council of India. But the principles were fashioned here. And that's why the right to information is tethered in the roots of reality. It cannot fly because all that is needed for people at that level, they tether. It's also a great, I think, gratitude that India owes these very poor people, that they sat there and spent so many months thinking practically of what could and what should and what will be possible, and gave to the rest of India not a law just for themselves, but for everybody. And this universal understanding of the need for transparency is phenomenal. I remember Prabhash Joshi was an eminent journalist, and editor of Jansatta for a period of time, and also in the Indian Express, who came and said, we journalists asked for information for ourselves, but citizens asking for it and poor citizens asking for it is much more powerful, and we should support it. And he gave the campaign, People's Right to Information was coined by him, and he said it in Hindi, Suchna ke adhikar, Jan adhikar ka rashtra abhiyan, Jan zarur dalna chahiye. People's right to information. It's not any particular set of people's right to information. So it is from this point of view that transparency and accountability are vital, because it is a road to success. Now I want to tell you a few stories. You would think that the most controversial and critical thing today is to ask any question about religion in India. The moment you ask anything about a temple or a mosque or a gurdwara or a church, you're in the doghouse, because it's the most sensitive of issues. I have a colleague called Keema Ram. This is the place where all the discussions took place. I thought you might like to have a look at it. Anyway, but Keema Ram, I think this is distracting. Should I stop it? This is the first public hearing we had, which is, I'm coming to it. Sorry, Somnath, I'm really... So, Keema Ram went to the local Thana and he found a temple had been built there. You know that in India, by the way, we are a secular country. And what does secularism mean? That the state is anti-religion?
It is non-religious.
Yes. State has no religion, which means that it's fair and equal to all religions. There's a large section of the Indian population that would say that the word secular is anti-religion, and therefore it should be, there should be a constitutional amendment to remove it. It's a little low now. Maybe when the elections come, it will be hyped up again, I don't know. But so far the argument has gone down. But there used to be this repeated argument. So he went to this temple, police station, and he said, look at the use of RTI. He didn't say, you're not allowed to build temples, why did you build a temple? No. He said, I want to know under which rule and which government order this temple is being built. And he took a photograph because it was built in the name of the Thanedar's father, the CI's father. So he took a photograph and he said, you know, I had a dream. My father came to my dream last, he told them, he didn't write it in that. Came in my dream and he said, unless you build me a temple in that police station, my soul will not be in peace. So I want to know, how did you get this temple built so that I can also build a temple? And when they didn't give him the information, it went up and the SP called him. He said, why do you want to know this information about the temple? He said, you know, my father's really been troubling me and I have to give it. So you have to give me the information. Finally, they removed the dedication at the end of the temple thing. They gave him some information and now he's collecting information about all such temples. Then we'll have to have a real confrontation to remove such structures from public spaces. We also have the Saraswati Vandana now made compulsory. We have Saraswati Murtis everywhere, including West Bengal. So these are all issues in which if you go into direct confrontation, you've had it, there will be polarization in society, you'll have the Hindus on one side, the Muslims on the other, the secularists in the middle, and then it will be hyped up, and then you'll have a couple of people killed, and then you'll have newspaper reports. So I'm just trying to tell you, in the most contentious of issues, how RTI has worked. Dalits, they have used it. Temple entry, prevented from entering a temple, they've used it. Atrocities on them, they've used it. The victims of Gujarat genocide have used right to information. Where they used to be chucked out of the police stations, they've been given a chair to sit on, they've been a cup of tea, and they've been given information. Some level of success of all the cases we fought in Gujarat have been because of the RTI. I went to Manipur recently, and there I met gun widows. We all oppose a democratic country in which, in parts of the country, you have the Armed Forces Special Powers Act. How many of you have seen that Manipuri film of women protesting against the rape by the army? You haven't seen it? Sometimes you must see it. It's one of the most powerful documentaries I've ever seen. When women were being raped by the army, they went and stripped themselves naked. So you see the backs of these women. And all the cops there, and they said, okay, rape us. What a powerful statement that was. It went all over the world. And since then, there's been a great change in the way the army has behaved with women. So in Manipur, it's also a question of, at one point of time, till 5 years ago, the integrity and the capacity of a police officer was determined by how many people he had killed who were insurgents. So they had to achieve their targets. So they killed anybody. Some may have been really insurgents, but many people were just killed because the targets had to be filled. And I met these women, thousands of women who are called gun widows. Young girls, beautiful girls. And I tell you, I've never been so close to tears as I was when I was with them. Because they were soft, compassionate, kind people. In spite of the worst kind of atrocity on them, they didn't have hatred and revenge as their motto. It made it all the more sorrowful for me. And they came and they said they didn't know who I was. They came and said to me that the right to information is the only tool they have had to get some welfare from the government. And it's been very difficult, but at least they've been able to apply under RTI to get educational allowances for their children and for some kind of welfare activities. So the right to information, in a sense, has helped across the spectrum. It has also unearthed many big scams. It's been the first tool through which scams have been exposed, the first tool through which policies have been exposed. The BT Brinjal, for instance, the whole experiments on the Brinjals, the negative impact on people. Engineers Without Borders, Doctors Without Borders use right to information. Today it's impossible to know who's using right to information, it's spread all over. But transparency has also failed in terms of government action. One thing people were asking me, volunteers, what they can do, is to help force the government, shame it, to comply with its own disclosure policies. It is not disclosed as well as it should. They are supposed to put out in front of every office what they have in terms of their obligations. They haven't done it. And the only real fantastic system has been in the Ministry of Rural Development, which despite the severest odds has got this wonderful website, however badly it may be in details, filled in details, where you can see exactly how much money a woman in a particular village or a man in a particular village, in a particular district, in a particular state in India has earned and how many days they have worked. So all that they were trying to suppress by not giving information, we've been able to get information. The Right to Information campaign has also unearthed a mode which has now become very popular all over the country, and this is being used for many kinds of democratic rights being asserted, and that is the public hearing. What you see at the back is the first public hearing, and in this actually we were threatened in 1994, and we were threatened that we would be killed if we entered the village. Despite that, under this parachute, it's a parachute which was pitched by some of the villagers, we had the first public hearing. And we called people, and the journalists would not come, we told them they'd get very good stories. So finally, one turned up from Navbharat Times. And from then on, history was made. But that one day was really dramatic. The people in the village kept us at home and said, you sleep with us, don't sleep in the school, the gundas will beat you up. And the next day, this public hearing. What is a public hearing? You distribute information which you have about the village, about works in the village, about public works. People see, read, understand, agree or disagree, then they come to the public hearing to testify in front of a panel. And they say exactly what is wrong and what is right. And then because the panel also consists or should consist of government officials, you insist that they take it up as an issue with governance. In this public hearing, mode that was introduced at that time, which became very, very popular with people and was a real problem with the government, a new institution called the social audit has emerged. And the MGNREGA has a social audit process as part of its mandatory provisions. And in Andhra Pradesh, the government of Andhra Pradesh government has taken this up. And again, I have a friend at the back who comes from Andhra who might be able to throw some light why Andhra has done it and no other state has done it. But in the state of Andhra Pradesh, they have adopted social audit, and through the social audit process, they have recovered more than 30 crores of defalcated money through small social audits like this, held in the villages and panchayats of Andhra Pradesh from NREGA. So I think there are various systems that have been brought in, various patterns that have been brought in, and what is most exciting for people like us about Andhra Pradesh was it was introduced when one of their most corrupt chief ministers was in place. And the chief minister was persuaded that if you thieve from the poor, then you will lose the elections. You have to thieve, you look elsewhere. The poor must be left alone. And he bought it. So he told his MLAs, you come to me with any complaint from the social audit process, I am not listening. You've been caught, you have to pay for it. But he made lots of money on land deals. But because of that, and in this the bureaucracy played such a good role, because it was their persuasion that finally made the chief minister agree to social audit being an independent process. So we are all now fighting with our state governments to have this in place, and there's tremendous resistance. There's more resistance to this than you could imagine. In Rajasthan, where this process was born, we are banned from entering the villages if there's a social audit process. They don't want us there. They're petrified. Even if I go as an observer, they're petrified. MLAs from all political parties sat on the National Highway number 8 between Delhi and Jaipur to say that there should be no social audit processes in Rajasthan. So if people protest so violently, it's a good tool. Point is, how do we press it and process it and take it further? In fact, even the Comptroller and Auditor General's office has accepted that the social audit process is a good process. And I think in some senses, what the CAG has done now and come out and said so many things has been because of this dialectic between the social auditors and the CAG. And they asked us many times, when we bring out our reports, nobody does anything. Why not? We said, you don't bring it out into the public domain, you put it into Parliament. Who's going to see it? So that is what this shows. So in a fight for transparency and accountability against corruption, you need details. And the English said, the devil lies in the details, and so it does. So how do you do this? So the transformation from corruption and this kind of preoccupation to what governance means is a major shift in the discourse that the Right to Information campaign has done. It's shifted the discourse from saying change this political party to that political party, to understand that no matter which political party comes, the bureaucracy is the same, the systems of delivery are the same, the decision-making process is the same, and we must control it. Just before I left Delhi, there was an article in the Times of India by somebody who's a researcher and a policy maker, whose name I've forgotten, whose name sounds either American or British, who wrote that the biggest enemy to removing poverty and to changing the imbalance in India and for corruption are the government orders that are passed. And they are all passed by petty bureaucrats. That the government order can nullify anything that a policy or a law brings in. It's so negative that by the time that you get the policy in action, that has completely destroyed what was put in place. There is much to say, but let me end here because I want to listen to some questions and also see what you want to know. But really, let me say that in the most important of these battles, if we want India to survive as a nation, we will have to question everything. We will have to question, like Partha Sarathi Ray, who's now under detention in West Bengal because he questioned the right of the West Bengal government. On the 8th of April, he was present with people from a slum who were being evicted in Calcutta. And he is in detention. And he is a well-renowned scientist who has lectured in the MIT, who is well known to people here. He's been put behind bars and there are no explanations. And we are now afraid that they are cooking up data against him and slap cases against him to say he's a Maoist. We are afraid. Another scientist from Jadavpur University distributed on the email some cartoons of Mamata Didi. And because he distributed these cartoons of Mamata Didi, he is also in jail. And the response of Omar Abdullah is quite interesting, because he has said, if I had to put every cartoonist and every cartoon that was made about me, if I had to put all the people in jail, the jails at Jammu and Kashmir won't have space. Because cartoon and lampooning is the right of every citizen. It's the only way we can make a commentary on politics. So whether it is Parthure, or whether it is the scientist from Jadavpur University, or whether it is the fact that M.F. Hussain was really thrown out of India and not allowed to come back, and he died in exile, and Indians did not raise a voice, I really feel so hurt. A man who really brought up Indian art, he was not allowed to come back to the home of his birth before he died. All he wanted was to be in India. And I think in this, all of you failed as much as we did, because I think if you had made a noise, the Indians in India would have heard you. Now we have policing, moral policing. You have, if you can't have women go to pubs. So while we fight and get our rights and we get governance going, there is a whole stream of negative movements which impact fundamental right to freedom of expression and the right to hold a different point of view. So I think India, there are no dearth of opportunities. The young volunteers were saying, what should we do when we come to India? Depends on you, whether you want to fight for women's rights or these larger issues, or you want to fight against media, which is now getting completely corporatized. You know that MTV is, what is it? TV18, what is it? I always forget. It's been bought by Ambani. So Ambani, now you can't oppose Ambani, because if you oppose Ambani, you'll never be in his TV. And because you're not in his TV, you'll not be a movement. You can be 2 lakhs of people in Delhi. The TV covers you only, then you're a movement. So if 2 lakh tribals come to us from all over India to Delhi, and they're not covered by the TV and the paper, we don't exist. If thousands of women get together and say something, they don't exist. You have lakhs of Dalit get together somewhere, they are not reported on, they don't exist. So what is in the media exists. Now this is very dangerous for democracy, very dangerous for all of us, and somewhere I feel there must be some expressed critique of all these kinds of factors that are coming in. So we will end up with someone who please